Good evening, everyone. Today we're going to be tackling another question in our question series, and this one is a big one. One that I can't really fully answer in our time, but one that I want to help get us started on. And that question is, how do we know that God exists? Okay, it's hard to find a question that you could really say is for sure bigger or more important. Like, there are equally important questions like, who is Jesus? But we're going to just start with this really big, kind of basic, fundamental question. Because obviously, if we want to grow in our faith in God, and if we want to share our faith with others, well, then we have to believe that God is real. And if we're sharing it, we probably want to be able to explain evidence or reasons why we believe God is real. So, because this is such a big question, though, I'm honestly not going to be able to tell you everything that could be said regarding the questions like, how do we know that God exists? We've got about 15 minutes, and I'm going to try to summarize thousands of years of people's thoughts and experiences with God. So, sit back and buckle up. But that doesn't mean that we can't get started just because it's a big topic. And so today what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on some arguments for why I think that God does exist. And because there are so many different arguments people can use, I'm not going to deal with arguments for why God doesn't exist or arguments against the existence of God. So I'm not going to do that today. I'll do that in another one if you guys have specific questions like that. So the question like, why do bad things happen to good people? We're going to save that for another time. Okay. So I'm going to introduce and even give like the technical names for some of these arguments. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to explain the basic idea, and then I'm going to go into a little bit more detail. If a little bit more detail is over your head, that's okay. Don't panic. If you understood the basic idea, you understood what you need to understand for now. And just know, like someday, when you come back to this, there might be even more for you to understand about these arguments for the existence of God. And you might come across questions that you don't know how to answer because that part went over your head. Probably a lot of those questions might happen in like college or maybe late high school. That would, you might need to come back to these, but I just want you to know that that's there. So the first one, though, that we're going to talk about is the Kalam Cosmological Argument for the existence of God. Okay, it just has a few simple statements. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. And so from there, to be a little bit less technical than we were with just those simple statements, we could argue that the cause of the universe is God himself, right? If the universe has a cause, it makes sense that it be God. But these three statements that we outlined right there at the beginning form what's called a deductive argument. And we're going to be using some kinds of deductive arguments. That basically means that if you believe the two premises, the first two statements, then you have to believe that the conclusion is also true. And the good news about that is actually that most people believe the first two statements. So if they do believe those, then they have to conclude that the conclusion is also true, that God exists, or the universe has a cause, and therefore, God exists. Now, granted, here's the thing, it's entirely possible for people to have beliefs that are in tension with each other, right? You could easily say, I see that the conclusion follows from these two premises. Like I can see that why that's what would happen. But since I don't believe the conclusion, then I know that something must be wrong with the premises, even though I don't know what's wrong with them. And that's actually okay for people to say in terms of being logical and everything like that. It doesn't mean that the argument was bad. It just means that that's sometimes how people will respond. But right now what I want to do is, so if people have doubts about the premises, well, why should we believe those premises? Why should we believe that everything that begins to exist has a cause? And why should we believe that the universe began to exist? Okay, and this is where things are going to get a little bit more technical, like I was talking about. If things go over your head, don't worry right now, because just know that if you do get a question about those premises, there are answers for why we believe those. There's more sophisticated ways that you can defend it. Even the way that I'm explaining it to you now is going to be a little bit simplified. And you might encounter some of these things someday in your life if you have lots of conversations about God with people. So anyway, the first premise is the idea that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Sometimes people will give pushback and say, no, there are things that begin to exist without a cause. Now, in our daily life, just about everything seems to have a cause, right? We know cause and effect, and we can see like, no, if you create like a milkshake, it's because you put like milk and ice cream together and started a blender. Like there was a cause for the milkshake. But some people will try to argue about quantum physics, and that quantum physics proves that there are things that begin to exist without a cause. So just briefly, let me say that quantum physics doesn't actually prove that. I'm not a theoretical physicist, so I don't know the details. And then I'm going to try to simplify the things that I sort of understand to you guys, so bear with me. But basically, what has been observed in the world is that sometimes at the subatomic level, so smaller than atoms, there's these particles that can appear and then disappear. And there's a lot of different theories, and some of those theories are like, yeah, it can just happen. Things can just start existing. So that led some people to say that there's no cause. But I think some of the better theories from what I sort of vaguely understand say that actually the particles appearing and disappearing is caused by energy. And quantum fields and other things. There are physical laws that predict to some degree when things are going to appear and disappear. They're not all worked out exactly how that all works, but they think that it's related to some other things that cause particles to appear and disappear. And so in some ways, though, the idea that energy could somehow become a particle is kind of like the reverse of like when we burn something in a fire. When we burn things in a fire, right, some mass is converted to heat, which is a form of energy. So with these subatomic particles, I think, though, again, I don't know, it's a little bit like that, where energy becomes mass. It's going in reverse of the order that you'd expect it to. Now, regardless of that, if these tiny little particles can do that, we're a long way from saying the whole entire universe could do that, right? That the universe could do that. So regardless, it seems though like things that begin to exist have a cause, and that there's no real precedent for something like, you know, a universe just popping up. And then as far as evidence that the universe itself began to exist, because some people will say like, well, hasn't the universe always been here? Well, we should know obviously that as Christians, we believe that God created it, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But obviously, if someone doesn't believe in God or doesn't believe in the Bible, they don't accept that. And if people don't accept that, they still might accept the idea that the universe began to exist. Because the observations have said that the universe is expanding. And if you say it's expanding now, well, you kind of go back in time and you say, oh, it used to be all kind of smushed up together. So there was a beginning point in that. And that's actually kind of what the Big Bang Theory is. It says that the world had a beginning. And we might think of that and be like, ooh, is that contradicting the Bible? Well, maybe we could talk about Bible timelines and things like that, and maybe the timelines are different. But it's certainly not contradicting the Bible to say that the world had a beginning. And they both lead to that conclusion where there was a moment where the universe began to exist. So we can use that idea and say like, well, don't you believe the world began to exist? And we can worry about any timeline discrepancies later. And then to get even more technical about how this kind of works out, there's no real possibility that what's called an actual infinity exists, which basically means that you can't add things one by one until you reach infinity. Basically, we couldn't get to the time that we're at right now by adding one moment by one moment until you reach today, unless time started at a point, right? If you count right now, you go 1, 2, 3, 4, and you could keep going forever and ever, but you never be like, infinity, got it, right? In the same way with time, we can't reach today saying like, okay, -1, -2, -3. We would never reach infinity backwards, so we could never reach today. So what we can do though, or we can go to explain how we get to today, is that some idea of God, not necessarily the Christian God, but some concept of God has to be the cause of these things. He's has to be non-physical, right? Because there's no physics before the universe begins. He's have to be timeless, spaceless, and causeless, and would have to make a decision to create. So that's obviously not everything that we need to believe about God as Christians, but it's still a lot of things that we could convince someone of just using this argument. And honestly, this is oftentimes considered one of the best arguments for God's existence. And even if some of that went over your head, I think the basic idea, those 3 sentences, It's probably something that you can understand. And here's the next one. It's called like a teleological argument for God, but it's basically the idea or like the design argument for God. And here's the basics of it. If something is designed, then it has a designer. The world is designed, therefore it has a designer, right? And then we go from there to say that the designer is God, right? Now, this is obviously only convincing if you believe that the world is designed. And so generally we have to really work at that second one, that the world is designed to convince people that the world is designed if they don't already believe in God. But at the same time, honestly, as we look around the world, much of it does seem like God designed the world, right? And I believe that God actually designed us to see the world that way. He designed us to look at it and for us to see him. So don't discount the fact that things seem designed to us, because I think God actually made us to see it that way. But that honestly probably won't convince your atheist friend. They probably won't they probably won't be convinced by that argument. And unfortunately, if we try to argue that the world is designed based on the idea of like, well, evolution couldn't happen, that's probably going to be an uphill battle with them too, because they're just going to say like, oh, well, I know a lot of scientists believe it, so I don't know why I should trust you. Even if you learn all the proofs against evolution, and those are important, a lot of times it's not going to be convincing to people who already believe in evolution, because they'll just say, oh, I trust the scientists. They don't even have to have any reason to believe in evolution other than that, and they'll probably be content. So it's probably better, though it's pretty complicated, to point out what are a better tactic to prove that the world is designed is to point out what are called the physical constants in the universe. This is, I think, a better area to focus on if we're arguing about that the universe seems to be designed. Okay? And that all has to do with the relative strength of gravity compared to things like the forces that hold atoms together. Okay? Those fundamental things, like crazy stuff that honestly you and I probably don't really think about very much. So without getting into the details of that, though, because I don't understand those details very well, basically, if anything was slightly different, any slight deviation from like the strength of gravity compared to the weak nuclear force or the strong nuclear force or these other forces in the universe, that would result in things either expanding to the point where there are no stars in the world, let alone planets or complex atoms, things that, life is made out of, right? Or if they were slightly off in the other direction, it could result in everything like collapsing back into becoming like what would basically be like a giant black hole. And so there's no reason, though, that we know of, like why the universe actually ended up the way that it did, where there are stars. And if there's stars, then there's the possibility of life forming. Like we're a long way from getting to like actual human lives or anything like that, but just thinking about the possibility of a star forming, the odds are almost impossible. It's basically 1 in 10 followed by 200 zeros, or more than that, I think. Okay, that's a big number. Like 200 zeros, more than 200 zeros. Like it wouldn't happen realistically. So often that can be a little bit more convincing to people that maybe God designed it this way. Because if we think about the odds of this world just like happening to make stars, let alone us like evolving after the stars are made, like 1 in over 200 zeros, like that's so impossible, guys. It's so much more likely that a God said, let me make this work out so that there are stars and people, right? And so anyway, this argument can be a persuasive argument that I'm talking about, the teleological argument, because a lot of times people do have this sense that the world is designed, that God did make things the way that he did. And hopefully, even if they don't feel that way, maybe talking about the physical constants of the world, maybe that could be a way to do it. Maybe it's just over people's heads, and that's okay too. You don't have to use each of these arguments. Just know that smart people are able to use these, and that there's really some good reasons to believe in God, even if at some level they have to be more nuanced than what I'm explaining. The next one I'm going to talk about is one that just might be over your head, because it's kind of a little bit over my head in some ways too. It's called the ontological argument. So most people, when they hear it, they're like, what? But every now and then people are like, oh my gosh, this is amazing and cool. And I kind of alternate. Every now and then I think it's amazing, and sometimes I'm just like, I'm not sure. Anyway, but for this argument, it kind of starts with a definition of God. And I'm going to be giving one version of it called, by Alvin Plantinga. But there are other versions of it, the most famous one by Anselm. Anyway, it starts with a definition where God is defined as a maximally great being. So things that we are familiar with, like he's all-knowing, he's all-powerful, all those kinds of things. And one of those things that makes God maximally great, the greatest he could be, is that he exists necessarily in all possible worlds. So if there were any other universe or world, God would exist there because he exists necessarily. That's part of being as great as possible. Okay. So then this one just goes from there. It is possible that a maximally great being exists. That's the premise. And then the conclusion is, therefore, a maximally great being exists necessarily. You might be like, wait, what? I don't know what that means. Basically, it says that if it is possible that God exists, then God must exist because he would exist necessarily. He would exist in all possible worlds. So in some ways, it means that to deny God, what you have to believe is that not only does God not exist, but it's not possible that God exists. It's impossible. But that could feel strange to someone, and it might go over people's heads. And there's also a lot more details and versions of it that can get into this. And that would, but for the sake of time and for comprehension, I'm just not going to go into them. But just know that basically what the ontological argument can show you is that if it's possible that God exists, then he does. The next one, the moral argument, which just goes something like this. And this is a common argument that people make, right? If moral laws are real, then God caused them in some way, right? And moral laws are real, and so therefore God caused moral laws. And obviously, if God can cause moral laws, God exists. So obviously that depends on people believing in both of the premises, right? Because sometimes people will try to deny that morality is real. And that's honestly fairly hard to deny, but people will try. We all know that murder is wrong, and it's not wrong just because the law says it's wrong. We know that it's wrong because it's wrong. And that's why we as like humanity didn't decide to let people off the hook in concentration camps just because they were quote unquote following orders, right? Like just to give like a big example of something very wrong that people did. We said, no, that was wrong, even though it was legally required for you to do. You should have not done it. And for most people, it seems fairly intuitive that if there are moral laws, then there have to be caused by somebody giving the law, just like human laws are given by a human lawgiver. Moral laws would probably have to come from some sort of moral lawgiver who would be God. But not everyone will immediately believe that, though. And honestly, it's pretty difficult to argue that technically. There's a lot that would go into it, but I don't think we have the time to go into that. So, but it might be helpful just to point out that they probably don't have a really convincing way to explain how those laws would come about. Even if they say like, oh, I don't know if God had to cause them. And then you just be like, okay, then what does? They'd be like, I don't know. And that might be good for them to realize and help them to consider whether or not God might be the one. Because honestly, the idea that God can make moral laws, to most people, that makes sense. And then here's a last way that I want to just go over very briefly. It basically goes something like this. Many people have had religious experiences, and then the best explanation of those religious experiences is that God is real. Therefore, God exists, right? So that one doesn't 100% prove that God exists, but it says basically God is the best explanation for what we observe in the world. And the idea is that many different people have had religious experiences of some sort. And generally speaking, when other people tell us they experience something, we trust them. And there's not much difference between religious experience and sense perception, right? The only major difference is that religious experience is not usually shared at the same time, right? We can both look at the same tree and be like, I see a tree, you see a tree. But religious experience is usually, though not always, a little bit more personal, like I see God and you don't right now. But that doesn't mean that it's not real. Because people often do have similar religious experiences, just at different times and places. And since we do want to trust people, it's probably fair to trust them even with religious experiences, even if you haven't had any yourself. But as a side note, as a Christian, hopefully you have had some experiences with God yourself. Like hopefully that's something that you've had, not maybe necessarily a dramatic one like Moses or Paul, right? They've had very dramatic religious experiences, but maybe you felt God's presence in some way. And I wouldn't try to second guess the value of that, especially for yourself, right? God gave you that experience, so treasure it and remember it. And if your friend asks you why they haven't had any experiences, maybe just suggest that they begin trying. Like maybe they've tried before, but maybe suggest that they continue trying. Because we generally only experience things when we start trying to experience them, right? If I close my eyes, I wouldn't see anything. If I avoided music, then I wouldn't ever hear Beethoven. It may take time for them to experience something religiously because they'll basically need to get training to use their God senses, right? Like I'm about to have a baby, and when baby comes out, baby's not going to understand what's going on. They're not going to be able to see, you know, and understand like, oh, I'm seeing a human right now, right? Because they don't know what a human looks like. But as they use their sense of sight, they're going to understand what it means. In a similar way, with our God senses, more or less, um, when they first maybe see something, they're not going to know what it means or what it is. But over a time of worshiping and praying, that other person might begin to experience God. So just because it's a more difficult sense doesn't mean that it's not a real sense, not something that God gave us to understand and see Him. So overall, I think there are many reasons why we could believe in God. I gave you 5. And there are honestly many more that I could give. And each of these reasons individually might be good enough for you to believe in God. And maybe you don't feel like you don't even personally need a reason because perhaps you've had an experience of God already and you don't need anyone to tell you about it. Like you don't need the argument from experience to tell you that a lot of people have experiences of God because you're like, yeah, I was one of them. Maybe you just really trust, what your parents or people in the church have told you. That's great. Regardless, though, it can be helpful when you have a conversation with someone else to know these arguments. And if you ever do experience doubts about God, because a lot of us do a lot of the time, it can be helpful to know that there really are good reasons to believe that God exists. So, and as a reminder, and this is important to me because I've thought about a lot of these things a lot more than I can share with you guys right now. This is just a 15-minute video, right? These can go way, way deeper. So if you find someone who has a question about these arguments or says like, I think actually your argument's wrong because of this, just please look up other responses of other Christians that are smarter than you and I, and they might have a lot more details about why we can still trust that God exists, even though there's an objection. I've intentionally not included everything because there's just not time, and it's just there's a lot of technicalities that can go into things. So we're going to start a discussion on the Zoom. So the discussion will be, which argument for the existence of God did you find more convincing? Which one was the most confusing maybe to you? Have you ever heard these arguments before or something like them? And then we're going to do something kind of fun, potentially, at least. Well, I think it might be fun. We'll see if you guys do. But I'm going to pretend that I'm not a Christian. And then I'll have you guys, or one of you guys, practice helping me understand these arguments. Okay? So I look forward to talking with you guys and seeing you in the discussion and look forward to that.